Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and discover how an ancient ecological disaster nearly destroyed the Roman Republic before the empire even began. We so often think of Rome's greatest threats coming from rival empires or legendary generals like Hannibal. But today, we're looking at a completely different kind of existential crisis. Now ask yourself, how does a highly structured, highly organized military deal with a relentless, moving nation? Because this wasn't just your traditional army of soldiers. This was literally an unstoppable mass of humanity. We're talking hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children desperately seeking a new home. It was a complete collision of worlds. On one side, you have this desperate migrating coalition, and on the other, the most powerful republic in the Mediterranean, whose sheer arrogance would repeatedly lead them to absolute catastrophe.
So here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, the Cimbrian flood, then clashing with Rome, the Arausio catastrophe, bypassing Italy, and finally, the Celtiberian halt. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The Cimbrian flood, driven from the north. Our story begins sometime between 1020 and 115 BC, when a catastrophic ecological disruption, historically described as the Cimbrian flood, forced a truly monumental exodus. The Cimbri, the Teutons, and the Ambrones were forced to completely abandon their ancestral territories near the North Sea, specifically the Jutland Peninsula in modern-day Denmark. Now, what's really interesting here is that while the ancient Greek geographer Strabo highly doubted that a massive coastal inundation could drive an entire populace from their land, Roman chroniclers firmly insisted it was true. Whatever the exact environmental trigger actually was, it set into motion this massive, desperate search for survival. To truly understand what Rome was up against, you've got to picture their way of life. This was not a conventional military invasion by any means. It was an entire society on the move. They transported their families, their livestock, the whole shebang, in these massive wagon trains. When they felt threatened, they'd draw these heavy transport wagons into a tight circle, creating a mobile defensive perimeter known as a wagenburg. Behind this perimeter, warriors could rally, and the women would fiercely defend the tribe's assets. And in a really fascinating cultural twist, they were governed by distinct religious structures, with powerful female priestesses conducting sacred rites and even prophesying the outcomes of battles. They were essentially a self-contained rolling city. Section 2. Clashing with Rome, the gathering storm on the Danube. As this swelling coalition wound its way down through Europe, pushing those heavy transport wagons for thousands of miles, they clashed with various Celtic tribes, sometimes defeating them and absorbing their survivors right into the fold. By 113 BC, this massive force arrived on the Danube in Noricum. Now, this region happened to be home to the Taurici, a Celtic tribe who were friends and allies of Rome. Unable to hold back this overwhelming tide of humanity on their own, the Taurici desperately called on the Roman Republic for aid. So, the Senate sends Consul Papirius Carbo to deal with the threat in 112 BC. Carbo, full of confidence, arrogantly demands the Cimbri and their allies leave the province peacefully. Recognizing Rome's formidable reputation, the migrating tribes actually agreed. They were going to leave. But Carbo saw an opportunity for personal glory and treacherously set up an ambush. Well, that plan completely backfired. The Cimbri discovered the trap, became totally enraged by the betrayal, and turned unexpectedly on the Romans. At the Battle of Nerea, they completely routed the Roman legions, nearly killing Carbo in the process. Rome's overconfidence had literally just unleashed a monster right on their doorstep. Which brings us to Section 3, the Arausio catastrophe, Rome's darkest day. Let's jump forward to 105 BC. Rome dispatches its absolute largest army since the days of Hannibal to end this Germanic threat once and for all on the banks of the Rhone River. The Republic mustered an awe-inspiring force of over 80,000 legionaries, plus tens of thousands of allied auxiliaries. But there was a fatal divide in Roman leadership. The army was split between two commanders who absolutely despised one another. Proconsul Caepio was an arrogant patrician aristocrat, and he flat-out refused to take orders from Consul Maximus simply because Maximus was a plebeian, a new man, even though Maximus technically outranked him. Their class prejudice was so incredibly severe that they literally erected separate camps on opposite sides of the river. They refused to share space or merge their forces into a single, overwhelming army out of pure snobbery. And the cost of those massive egos was absolute slaughter. On October 6th, 105 BC, the Cimbri and Teutons launched a devastating assault. The overconfident Caepio foolishly attacked without support, and his forces were just wiped out. Then, the victorious warriors turned their full fury on Maximus's isolated and demoralized camp. Pinned against the carnage-choked Rhone River, the uncoordinated Roman legions were utterly dismantled. Over 80,000 Roman soldiers, plus up to 40,000 camp followers and auxiliaries, perished. The Battle of Arasuio was the greatest, costliest defeat Rome had suffered since the massacre at Cannae over a century earlier. So with their massive army annihilated, the road directly to Rome was left wide open and completely unguarded. The Republic was bleeding out its best men. An intense, paralyzing terror swept through the capital, a cultural phenomenon later known as the Terror Cimbricus. The citizens of Rome frantically awaited a deadly barbarian invasion they simply no longer had the manpower to stop. The end of the Republic felt entirely imminent.
Section 4. Bypassing Italy, the baffling diversion.
But then, just when the Republic was at its absolute most vulnerable, completely defenseless, the invaders did something strategically incomprehensible. Instead of marching on a defenseless Rome to finish them off, they literally just packed up their wagons and went west. They moved directly into Gaul. It was a bizarre strategic anticlimax that left Roman observers utterly baffled. I mean, the migrating horde had at least 2 historic opportunities to march on Rome and choke out the Republic, and both times they went the opposite way following decisive victories. Why? Because to the Cimbri and Teutons, the Roman Republic was just an incidental roadblock. They had no historical grievance like Hannibal did. They were simply a migrating band of people heavily focused on finding reliable food sources and fertile lands for resettlement. They just happened to stumble across a rising superpower.
As the historian Theodore Mommsen brilliantly noted, their fighting style was terrifying yet deeply cultural. Despite being labeled Germanic, their warfare was heavily influenced by the Celts. They wielded these large swords, wore copper helmets, used peculiar missile weapons, and carried long, narrow shields. In their most dangerous combats, the frontline warriors would even tie their metallic girdles together with cords to create an unbreakable physical phalanx. It's an incredible image. But despite these terrifying battlefield tactics, they were fundamentally just hungry migrants seeking a home, not calculating empire builders. Which brings us to our final section. Section 5. The Celtiberian Halt. A coalition holds the line. Following their baffling diversion away from Rome, the massive horde actually ends up splitting up. The Teutons decided to remain behind in Gaul, kind of lingering in the region. The Cimbri, however, pushed further southwest. They crossed over the Pyrenees and poured directly into the Iberian Peninsula, also known as Hispania. But here, they finally met their match. In a great twist of historical irony, it wasn't a Roman legion that stopped them, but a fierce Celtiberian coalition. Failing to win new lands from the local Celts in Spain, the Cimbri's seemingly unstoppable momentum was finally broken, forcing them to turn back north toward Gaul to reunite with the Teutons. So what's the big takeaway from all of this? It's crazy to think about how a simple, almost accidental change in a migration path fundamentally altered world history. By wandering off into Spain and Gaul instead of marching on a defenseless Italy, the Cimbri inadvertently bought Rome a vital window of several years. And that gave the brilliant general Gaius Marius the exact time he needed to radically reform the Roman legions into a professional fighting force, one that would eventually return to wipe the migrating tribes out entirely. But it does leave us with a haunting question, doesn't it? If the Cimbri had just marched south right after Arasio, would the Roman Empire have ever even existed? Thanks for exploring this with me today, and keep asking those big questions.